Good evening. This meeting of the Board of Education for February 4th, 2013 is called to order. Welcome to everyone present and to our television viewers. All items that will be voted on have been posted as required by state law. This meeting is being televised and will be replayed throughout the next 2 weeks. If you're interested in watching that, please check the board website for replay times. And just a note, Director Sargent is absent and Director Regan will be joining us shortly. At this time, we're going to allow 20 minutes for public comment, and before I check with Ms. Houston as to whether or not we have public comment, as she calls the people forward, I'll start reading our expectations for public comment. Ms. Houston, do we have any public comment?
We have 5. Our first 2 speakers, Joshua Cohen and Eric Ridgeway.
Great. If they could come up and have a seat. So our instructions are that our responsibility as a board lies in actively listening and reflecting on the thoughts and opinions of others. The board will not respond to any comments or questions at this time, but we will follow up on various issues that are raised. Guidelines for public input emphasizes respect and consideration when referring to board members, staff, and other presenters. You'll have a total of 3 minutes to share your comments. Please begin by stating your name and spelling your last name for the record. During the first 2 minutes of your testimony, a green light will appear. When you have 1 minute remaining, a yellow light will appear. And when your time is up, the red light will go on and a buzzer will sound. It's not too loud of a buzzer, it's just a little buzzer. And we respectfully ask that you conclude your comments at that time. I will probably ask you to wrap up if you could just finish up your comment or two if you continue to go long. We sincerely appreciate your input and we thank you for your cooperation.
My name is Joshua Cohen, spelled C-O-H-E-N. I live in the Arbor Lodge neighborhood, and I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak this evening in support of my son, who's a second grader at Chief Joseph, as well as my daughter, who starts kindergarten in 2014, and for the staff and families at Chief Joseph who worked so hard to make a great learning environment there. My own education is in architecture and engineering, and if you've seen any of the data stories on the Bucket Brigade blog, you'll understand that I am a details guy. I like to understand the cause of a problem and devise logical solutions. And I've spent the past 2 months learning about the problems in our Jefferson cluster schools and talking with stakeholders about solutions that could lead to better educational outcomes for our kids. Now, looking at where we stand tonight, I feel, to use a polite word, frustrated. The proposal you're going to hear tonight to consolidate students into King and Ockley Green seems totally driven by a desire to move bodies into particular buildings. And I don't feel there was ever an honest discussion about what kind of configuration would offer the best educational outcomes for Jefferson cluster students, particularly in the middle grades. We did have some general comments in support of the K-8 model, but never a detailed examination of how it was working in these schools with these students. So while I'm disappointed by the superintendent's proposal, I am also an optimist, and I would like to offer 2 suggestions to start us down a good path. Number 1 is to give us some certainty. This proposal leaves Chief Joe's closure date unspecified, and while that may be politically convenient, think about the message that sends it to say, we intend to close Chief Joe as soon as your new K-8 program gets small enough. It's not exactly a ringing endorsement that would attract families who are making enrollment and transfer decisions next month. A better move would be to guarantee that Chief Joseph will remain open at least through spring 2014 and propose a grade configuration now so that people will know what to expect. For example, a K4 and 5/8 split would minimize disruption for current students while eliminating the need for portables at Chief Joe. And second, I'd like to ask that you give us some respect. We may not be the people who sign your checks, but we are your customers. And if you keep the future of our schools hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and vaguely worded letters and weak leadership, we will vote with our feet and find other education options. On the other hand, if you're willing to open the doors and let us participate in solving the difficult problems facing our neighborhood schools, we will show up in droves and achieve results that had not previously seemed possible. The enrollment balancing staff is going to move on to the Roosevelt cluster next year, and we are still going to be here trying to sort things out. So please, let's work together on this.
Thank you.
My name is Eric Ridgeway, R-I-D-G-W-A-Y. Ladies and gentlemen of the school board, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you this evening. Judy Brennan stated that PPS has received mixed signals regarding the preference for K-5 or K-8 in this cluster, and Carol's recommendation is that we should wait before making any real change. I believe neither of these are true. Over the last 5 years in our cluster, enrollment between the 5th and 6th grade the following year drops by an average of 20%. These Jefferson Cluster students and families are saying something about where things need to change in our schools. In this cluster, the K-5 segment has a capture rate of 57%, but for grades 6 to 8, this capture rate drops to 38%. Not one school, but an entire cluster with a 38% capture rate. The neighborhoods in this cluster are saying that things need to change in our schools. In your own survey, despite a resistance to change and a majority of schools in a K-8 configuration, 57% of respondents supported the middle school model. We are saying what we want to change in our schools. If any single school in PPS had a capture rate of 38% or lost 20% of its population at the same point each year, the board would be rightfully demanding action. Yet here we sit with this problem across the entire cluster, and the recommendation is that essentially no action should be taken, that we should do nothing while year after year our 6th to 8th grade students suffer due to under-enrollment. This is simply not equitable or acceptable. To the board, I urge you vote down the currently submitted proposal, the one that says you see a systematic problem in grades 6 through 8, but don't care enough about the Jefferson cluster to act. Instead, explore ways to improve the proposed middle school option while incorporating the themes that you've heard from the community. Leave our neighborhood schools open and keep the equity lens in full focus. Use Ockley Green for older Chief Joe students during this transition, but rather than being the first step down the road to nowhere, closing a successful school and locking us into an educational model that few of our buildings can support, you could put us on the path to provide something better for all of our children. No one believes a middle school is a silver bullet for all of our problems, but it does provide the necessary density as a framework for success. When paired with future adjustments to the inequitable transfer policy, it could provide a strong, sustainable, diverse education in this cluster for years to come. The board knew going into this process that hard choices had to be made sooner rather than later. You were correct in those assumptions. Carol, you have mostly heard our request for not closing neighborhood programs, keeping equity in mind, and the need to review the transfer policy, and we thank you for listening. But now we ask one more thing from the board. Stand up to your responsibility and make those hard choices that we desperately need. Vote down this recommendation and provide us with a plan that provides a middle school for the children and the neighborhoods in the Jefferson cluster the best chance for success, both now and into the future. Thank you.
Ms. Eason?
Next, we have Greg Burrell and Julie Davis.
Julie Davis?
Good evening again. My name is Greg Burrell, B-U-R-R-I-L-L. And the last time I spoke, my gratitude was for you because I understand how hard your job is. Today, I want to highlight my gratitude for the way the David Douglas School District works with the Teachers Union. I taught with their co-president, Bob Gray, and he told me how their board relies on him to solicit input from teachers and consult with them in their decisions. He has a seat at board meetings and is part of the decision process. Now, the last time I was here, though, I made the bold claim that teachers and parents have the most important jobs on our planet. So I want you to reflect on this claim because as our leaders, I believe you also have an important job, and that job is to help turn the conversation in American politics from how little we can pay in taxes to what it really takes to provide the world-class services that the most powerful nation in the history of the planet deserves. I believe that when I want to talk about education reform because I've been reading the history of over 100 years of education reform. And almost never has education reform been led by teachers, the people that learn how to teach students, the people that do the amazing things. There are, nowadays we're being led by a business model. And, back in the 80s, business leaders learned that if you want great products, you let the people on the factory floor run the machines, right? I think it's time we learned that the people in the classrooms need to run education reform. I will be talking to you one more time before I present a full written documentation of my ideas, but I hope to see you all out with me on Lobby Day and out standing with the teachers union, standing with parents, standing with the general public in hopes that we can have the kind of schools that we deserve. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our last speaker is Rita Moore.
Thank you. My name is Rita Moore, M-O-O-R-E, and I'm speaking tonight on behalf of our Portland, our schools. We're asking the board to reject any school closures and any permanent changes in any cluster until we get a more comprehensive approach to the enrollment balancing process. And this position is based on two concerns. First is a flawed approach that's been taken to enrollment balancing, and secondly is what appears to be a flawed process. We share Sackett's perspective that a systemic approach to enrollment balancing is essential. Clusters cannot be seen in isolation, nor can individual schools. As we've seen before, a change anywhere in the system will inevitably have some follow-on effect elsewhere. Therefore, trying to balance enrollments in a specific set of schools in isolation seems both inefficient and ineffective. PPS documents state that fully 1/3 of all schools in the district have enrollment issues, either under or over capacity. If that's the case, a piecemeal approach to balancing enrollment seems self-defeating. In addition, it's clear that school enrollments are not static and are influenced by a complex range of issues, both external and internal. Unraveling that complexity and developing strategies that will ensure appropriate and sustainable enrollments in every school is undeniably challenging and time-consuming, and it's very high stakes for children and communities. Even the hint of closure can have a devastating impact on enrollments for many, many years. All the more reason to take a careful, systemic approach so that we can get it right as right as possible the first time. Which brings up the second issue, process. Based on consistent feedback we've heard from participants, OPUS is concerned that the Jefferson Cluster enrollment balancing process is irretrievably compromised by a lack of clarity on the purpose, structure, and implementation of public engagement process. The proposals don't have the support of the community. It's not meant as a criticism of the enrollment balancing team. Public process is always really difficult. By definition, it's time-consuming, it's messy, and it's complicated. We keep doing it because we know in our bones that collaborative decision-making done well produces more creative, satisfying, and durable solutions. But we have to do it well. PPS has demonstrated its commitment in principle to engaging with families and communities. In fact, a central theme of the bond campaign was deepening the relationship between schools and the broader community. But the quality of that process remains highly problematic. PPS has already done some of the foundational work necessary to do this well. The 2010 Public Engagement Framework that spells out 5 possible levels of engagement is a great starting point, but the framework alone is insufficient to ensure that any particular process will be productive. So there are lessons to be learned.
Thank you. Can you wrap it up, please?
Okay, maybe the most important lesson is that to do anything beyond level 2 engagement, you've got to give up some level of control. It's going to be really hard, but if you want to do public engagement, it's essential.
Thank
So,
you. Thank you. So for the past month, as you've all heard, the board has received some information, attended listening sessions, and discussed Jefferson enrollment balancing options. Tonight, we will receive the superintendent's recommendation, and I'd like to remind my colleagues that we will not discuss the recommendation tonight. However, we will receive a process timeline update and have a chance to ask any clarifying questions. The board will hold a public hearing on Jefferson enrollment balancing on Saturday, February 9th from 10 a.m. to noon in the Jefferson High School auditorium. And we will also devote the first 45 minutes of the board's February 11th study session to public comment on the topic. Superintendent Smith, can you please talk us through your recommendation?
Yes, I will. And I was debating whether or not to do a PowerPoint where I'm really walking you through very specific elements of this, or whether I'm just going to talk to you. And I'm electing to just talk to you. You've got two documents that actually have this laid out. And as you know, we've been engaged in a process where we had community involved in helping us design what the process would be, listening sessions that have been cluster-wide as well as individual school-specific. I think in any given listening session, you could come away with a feeling of, okay, there was consensus that this group is really believing K-8s are what they want to reinforce in this cluster for X number of reasons. You'd go to another meeting and you'd end up with a sense of middle school is the right direction for these reasons. I myself have really entertained the full spectrum of what's the right move to make in this cluster. The theme that ran through everybody's conversation was the instability over decades, essentially in the Jefferson cluster being the overarching theme, and how do we bring stability to this cluster. The recommendation you have in front of you basically responds to things we heard during the listening session, and requests to step back, take a look at some of our systemic policies, one being our enrollment and transfer policy that was developed in a very different time period to address really different concerns that the district had. And then since that time had No Child Left Behind laid on top of it, and had a particularly devastating effect on the Jefferson cluster, and has not been reviewed in light of our new equity policy. And so I am recommending one of the things that we do is step back and do a look at our enrollment and transfer policy, and specifically to ask the Superintendent's Advisory Committee on Enrollment and Transfer to be the ones that take a deep look at that policy and be part of recommending changes to us. Secondly, and you've heard this theme throughout, is for us to look at our boundary changes district-wide, and we're 3 years into an enrollment balancing process that we basically have done cluster by cluster, with the idea that we are creating enrollment stability to positively impact teaching and learning and how we staff our buildings, and that we have enough students to really offer strong programs in every one of our schools. But it has been cluster by cluster. And in every one of those, we've hit up against a moment where you start to consider the contiguous boundaries of the next cluster, but you've not done a process with the families in the contiguous areas. What it's led us to is really understanding, back up, take a moment where we do it for the district as a whole, because we may come up with very different solutions than we do when we're looking within a contained, currently defined cluster. So second recommendation, step back and do the district-wide look at boundaries. And then what that does is do a different set of what would be the recommendations, the actions we take within the Jefferson cluster at this moment in time, which are in the areas where we have the most acute under-enrollment that need some kind of an action in order to stabilize. So the two specific actions that I am looking at recommending to you, one is we've got K-8s throughout the cluster. Chief Joseph is our only K-5. It's now facing over-enrollment issues. We have Ockley Green that has a K-5 magnet, and 6-8 that is both magnet students, and Chief Joseph, 6th through 8th graders. My recommendation to you is to do a single K-8 in the but that combines the Chief Joseph and Ockley Green communities. And I am leaving that as the recommendation that I'm putting in front of you right now, with discussions still in front of us that engage those two communities in the specifics, specifically grade configuration of what remains on the Chief Joe campus, what goes to the Ockley Green campus in the near term, but with the idea that they would over time be merging onto the single Ockley Green campus. I'm also leaving open to involving the community in the decision about leadership, decision about naming of the school, but the concept is, again, that we would have a single strong K-8. The recommendation does not displace any of the current transfer students into Chief Joseph, so it leaves us able to serve all the students who are currently being served at Chief Joseph. It also closes the magnet portion, the K-5 magnet portion of Ockley Green, but does not displace students who are currently enrolled in the magnet. So they would have a choice of either continuing to attend the new neighborhood K-8, opting to transfer to King's Arts program, or return to their neighborhood school. So all three of those choices would be open for those students. And I purposefully am saying, we're allowing the circumstance for that neighborhood catchment area to create its own K-8, and leaving open the room for what does that look like as we transition to a single building, but would imply that we then are committing to something that remains stable over time. So not that it stays undefined, just that I want the voices of that community to be part of defining it. So that's the first one. The second one is we have King that has a small neighborhood catchment area. So even if every student in that neighborhood catchment attended King, it remains small. And given that we're recommending stepping back and doing the district-wide boundary change, I wouldn't recommend doing temporary boundary changes. What we do have is the opportunity to co-locate, and I would probably define a 3 to 5 year period of co-location that allows two small programs to grow. So the King neighborhood program and the Access program, which is currently located on the co-located on the Sabin campus. And it's essentially one that I would be looking to those two communities to identify what's the opportunity of co-location that allows them both to grow in this time period. The other features of this are really looking to the requests we heard from every single school community about please support us figuring out how we strengthen our neighborhood school, put a priority on neighborhood school. Numbers of our schools have identified what are core academic themes that drive them. We have an immersion program, we have an arts program, we have IB programs. We have a school that's identified they would like to have an environmental focus as a way of strengthening them. We have a 3 to PhD program in partnership with Concordia, and Concordia has said they indicated their willingness to expand their partnership to other schools in the cluster. So I think the other area I would be calling out as part of this is how do we as a district partner with each of those schools to strengthen their core academic program and really focus on understanding both why families are transferring out of the cluster and how do we draw families back in and really say how do we strengthen these neighborhood schools. We've got a really a strong desire for strong neighborhood schools in this cluster, and so I think this is about stability and helping to build them. You've also got called out in the report or the proposal identified costs for doing this transition. The moving the staff at King, Access, Ockley Green, and Chief Joseph, approximately $400,000, which we're looking at our construction excise tax revenues as a way to cover that. We anticipate reviewing technology and nutrition services supports within the schools and potential upgrades, looking at about $200,000. Transportation costs appear to be neutral. And the two larger processes that I've identified, so looking at district-wide boundary processes, I'm anticipating that would be us working with an external firm who actually does those kind of analytics about district mapping, and so I would anticipate a cost that I don't know what that would be at this point. and probably also a cost associated with supporting the work that engagement that our Student Advisory Committee on Enrollment and Transfer would require to do their work. So that is the essence of the proposal. It's really about reinforcing stability and stepping back and looking at this with a district-wide frame and not taking more wholesale change actions until we've done the district-wide frame. The thing this does not preclude is the eventual creation of a middle school in this cluster, but it's something that we would need to actually be drawing in the actual capture rate of the cluster in order to have the demand to sustain an additional offering in the cluster. So that door is not closed. It's just leaning into the configuration we currently have and working to strengthen it as opposed to doing a wholesale change at this moment in time. That's it.
Clarifying questions?
I can walk you through what.
mentioned special ed,
So in terms of special ed,
maintaining special ed at Woodlawn.
at Woodlawn,
Yeah.
which it maintains the programs that are, currently in
So
place at
there's
Woodlawn.
More stability.
It does more stability. It's
think it's
stability
important
for
to
the
point it
communities.
out.
I'm going to say, like, this is the biggest thing we heard from people was the cry for stability in the program and the relationships that are currently exist within their current programs being a really strong factor in student achievement. And so please lean in, maintain those relationships. I'd say the other thing that is an overlay in all of this is the kind of budget scenario we're looking at, which we, again, at the current moment with the governor's budget, it's a $17 million hole. I anticipate a lot of work going on in this legislative session that will hopefully not be that large of a gap by the time we're actually building our budget. But it's not going to be a big infusion of resource beyond what we already have that helps, that makes the experience feel different in our schools, so. Can I just do one more on process? So at this point, it's now out of my court as the listener and over to you. But just for people to know that February 9th, from 10 a.m. to noon, there's a public hearing at Jefferson High School. And you need to sign up in advance to testify. February 11th at 6 p.m., there's public testimony at the board meeting that will be here at BESC. And then February 25th at 6 p.m., the school board is scheduled to vote on the recommendation. And written feedback can be directed either to myself at carolsmith@pps.net or the school board or the school board at schoolboard, all one word, at pps.net. So, and I'll say that we've had a tremendous amount of public input that has been considered and wrestled with, and really, I think you hear a lot of that reflected in the proposal that I just put in front of you tonight. But we're still in process, so the feedback the board gets matters. So.
That's kind of a larger process question. So we're asking clarifying questions tonight as additional, so as we have kind of detail, follow-up, what does this mean, how would this work type of questions, what's going to be the venue both for us to understand that better from staff and for the public to also get that same information?
So February 11th will be a work session where there will be
Okay.
some time devoted to this. And then,
So if we provide our list of questions or whatever
Well,
in
yep.
in advance of that, so
Right.
staff has time to,
yes.
or I don't know if we want to try to have staff collate everything that, so that they don't hear the same type of question repeated
question.
5 different ways. Yeah.
Mhm.
So maybe we could work with you all to sort of set a deadline for when we need to
Have the question.
get that in, just so there's time to make sure there's the fullest answers possible, and then the public can also see the same,
Mhm.
same information. Would be helpful.
Are we gonna set up any sort of long-term plans beyond that? So like in the future?
So what I'm proposing is part of the long-term plan, and then the two things that I'm describing to you, the district-wide look at boundary process is would occur first. And then secondly, the looking at enrollment transfer policies, I mean, are both part of district-wide long-term plan.
And will we be engaging the community in that? Any sort of committees besides SACIT?
So SACIT, I will both look to recommend a process, but also to do, so they've been engaged for 3 years and looking deeply at our enrollment and transfer, both policy and processes. So I would ask them to take the lead and actually what the substance of change recommendations would be, but I will also ask them to recommend engagement process.
So that will be folded into whatever resolution we end up with here, that it'll both lay out immediate action, but also long-term?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. And so a couple, I guess I'm looking for more clarity on, you mentioned that the door had not closed on the middle school possibility, and I think there's going to need to be some clarity about what could that look like, or how would that work if we're at the same time, moving to kind of stabilize and recommit to or commit to a K-8 in this combined model.
And the immediate, what's in front of us is looking to stabilize the K-8, look at how do we regain enrollment in neighborhood schools. It's on this proposal, it's committing to build the K-8s and strengthen them as neighborhood schools and strengthen the enrollment that we have in them. And the reason that I say that doesn't close the door on the middle school, we don't have the enrollment in the Jefferson cluster right now to add another program and not have the effect of destabilizing the K-8. So you can't do both. And you need a critical mass. If one of our values is don't close neighborhood schools, then you need a critical mass that both can stay healthy as K-5s and feed a middle school in order to do that. And I think partly we're at the front end of rebuilding enrollment in these schools, that's where our effort needs to go at this moment.
Okay, so I guess it would be, I'll just try to map out in my list of questions kind of what I'm trying to get at to understand how that might work. Like, if we can try to even just walk through some hypotheticals of, okay, if we did this, then, and I would assume that part of our sort of mapping out here, here's kind of the charge or the main issues that long-term planning needs to take on, whether it's through one steering committee or multiple or a task force or whatever it might be, that this would be one of them. In other words, so that it's, potentially still on the table, that it's not, we need to keep all these issues at the forefront and up for discussion. I guess another question is looking for more clarity and detail around access at King. The concern we've heard that there might not be really enough room, and would special ed classrooms get moved out, those kinds of details.
So more specificity.
Yeah, and around
non-space.
So the statement just in general, I think, so the statement on page 3 of ensure that all schools in the Jefferson cluster are staffed to offer the full core program. So I think one thing I've been looking throughout this for more detail on is kind of show us what, A, what is currently offered, and B, what could be offered specifically in terms of core and also enrichments or electives or specials or whatever you want to call them, and what a sample schedule might look like, so you can get a sense of what would be different or better.
Combining access and King.
Combining. I mean, we've showed that chart kind of for Boise, Elliott, Humboldt combined, but I think as folks need more detail, I need more detail on what the combined program would actually offer, other than just it will be better and stronger.
And I think this one we have some example because Access has been co-located at Sabin for a number of years, and they've figured out some of where were the co-location opportunities and where are places they operate separately and we're together. It would be a whole separate conversation, I think, for these two school communities that is still in front of us.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I don't know if this, but I think sometimes I get the sense that staff sometimes shy away from that because, one, we don't know what our budget is.
Right.
So if we put up, this is what you'll gain,
Right.
based on now, people will come back and say, you promised us this. The second piece is, to me, it somewhat usurps what the community and our principal leadership would offer. Unless we can incorporate them into that conversation, but I don't.
I think this is part of the intent of where we're doing it. Here's the the broad stroke, and we're asking the school communities to then engage and identify where the opportunities, and that is part of what we identified in the proposal, is asking those two school communities to help us identify, so where are the potential opportunities you see from co-location. And it does, I mean, any co-location offers both opportunities and challenge, so none of these end up being like straightforward, yay. They're like, how are we making it work, and where are the opportunities in something that lets both of those programs grow in a shared location. So,
Any clarifying questions?
I think in terms of the King access discussion, I wanted to understand that Saban would still be stable if access moves out, so I wanted to,
we'll bring you data on that, but yes.
okay. And then I also wanted clarification on whether we would be looking potentially to be including the, I think it's called the King Neighborhood Center, in the discussion of merging those two programs.
And that's been raised as a question that we're investigating.
Okay.
And are we going to have some more specificity on what, in terms of the next steps with any merger of programs, like what would be the next steps in terms of the process for working with the community on leadership and grade configuration and how it all, I mean, is that going to be laid out pretty clear? Because there's so many questions about it right now, and I know we're just moving into this, but.
So we probably won't do that until a decision is made that it's happening.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's part of where we're in and I actually met with both the Chief Joe and Ockley staffs today to have this conversation about both where are we leaving room for them to be part of the shaping and what's the voice they should be having in the period of time we're in to be making what their desires known to you. But we would engage them in some of those decisions, like the grade configuration discussion about is it K4 and 5-8 because Chief Joe can't house, it's too large to hold its current 5 grades. So there's not a no action possibility here. We have to do something for Chief Joe because they're too large, just as their current size. Yeah. So, but could they retain like a K4 and a 5-8. There's been some, conversation about whether or not they would want to keep going on the 2 campuses as opposed to get all the way over to 1. Now would be the moment to be voicing those opinions.
Yeah, and I think just more information.
Now, not this minute, but during this process.
Right,
Yeah.
please hold your comments
Yeah.
so we can have a conversation. It's going to help us to get to a better answer if we can have a conversation. We see your signs. We've heard. This is our time to discuss it. Please, thank you.
So I think another thing that would be helpful would be, so I guess, okay, so at the study session, I just need staff to walk us through more of these details. Okay, so I'll be working on my list. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I needed to. Oh yeah, sure, go right ahead.
So have we had any discussion with the current families that are at Ockley Green about whether the 3 choices that you laid out, Carol, have we had any discussion with the family? And no, it's just been a short period of time, but maybe a discussion with them to find out where they think they may end up so that we could have a better idea about how many students we can move to Ockley Green?
Wait, so ask me that again.
So there's a certain number of students right now at Ockley Green. Do we know how many of those students will want to stay there? How many will want to move to King?
That are currently in the
How many will
magnet?
go back? Right,
No, I mean, this proposal just came out on Friday.
right. So what I'm saying is
Yeah.
I think that would be good for us to survey them to
Yeah.
find out in advance
What
what it
they're
will look like as far as Ockley Green students staying there. So we'll know how much room we have there
Correct.
to move Chief Joe.
Yes, we have, and that's 2, so we also have like 150 students who transfer into Chief Joe and the K through 5 who are in the magnet program at Ockley. Both of whom we're working to be able to offer this as a stable option, but who have multiple choices available to them. Yeah.
Director Morton.
Sure. So I think I have some questions around the cost of a move, the cost of a shift versus what we were talking about before in terms of portables for Chief Joseph. I think I'm really I think, personally interested in that moment when it sounded like folks were leaning towards K-8 versus middle school. Because I still, I was listening pretty intently and still heard a fairly balanced perspective on that. And in fact, I heard probably at the last community forum a pretty overwhelming support for a middle option. So I'm interested in the I guess just the justification of, okay, that decision. I also, and I can't help but think, we also obviously have to look at the longer term impact, the structure, the building at Chief Joe, and the investment that's been made, in that building itself, the community that has supported that building itself. Across the street at the park, you have Harper's Playground that is so there's been the point is there's been some investment in that particular area. So I'm really concerned about the second piece of this recommendation, and as soon as things grow, everyone shifts over there. When that happens, I'm also concerned about Ockley Green because, from my understanding, there's a cafeteria that's about half the size as the cafeteria at Chief Joe. So there's going to be some additional costs there too. So those things, and to me, I think and I know this isn't the opportunity to necessarily share opinions, but I guess what I'm looking for is what's going to help me feel like this is a move that actually gets to the issues that we're facing within the Jefferson cluster, or is it going to exacerbate those issues? And I don't know the answer to that, and I'm really hesitant to move forward on something that I'm not really sure about. And I guess I want to say to folks clapping, thank you, but I know each of my colleagues and Carol and the staff are thinking these same things. I'm thankful for the opportunity to be able to verbalize them, but these are not easy issues for any of us, and in fact they're very, very challenging, and I hope we can understand that and respect that. So I think the cost, obviously, I mentioned is still a question in my head, but I guess what I'm really interested in is how can we, in this process, make a decision that offers the least impact until we have a clear framework as to make our decisions from. And that clear framework obviously includes our equity policy, obviously includes our enrollment and transfer policy. And I'm not sure, I think probably 3 of the 4, or how many total are there, recommendations in this hit that, but I still have real reservations, particularly with the first recommendation with Chief Joseph.
Other clarifying questions? Okay. Director Gonzalez?
Yeah, I don't have a clarifying question in regards to the proposal because I think that's kind of at the table, and I think Superintendent Smith already stated, now it's on our court. And so I think it gets back to, as I listen to Director Morton's question in regards to what's going to make you feel comfortable, only you know that, of course. So I think that we need to get to that point in regards to what will make us feel comfortable to move forward on with any given thing that is at the table. And I hope that we get to that point in regards to begin to articulate that amongst ourselves to be able to then engage. Because part of as I listen to some of the comments, some of the things that were stated, many of them continue to seek more information. And I'm not sure that we're gonna be able to get more information beyond what is already at the table, at least not from staff. I mean, that's just my assessment of that it will be sufficient. And I think Director Knowles also asked for like perhaps more information in regards to the folks, in regards to the parents that potentially be impacted. And we do have a hearing scheduled, so hopefully some of those folks will show up. But so I'm curious in regards to what will make us feel comfortable with moving forward one way or another? Or do we have, based on whatever we believe, enough information already to either, approve this proposal or not? And I think that's a question I think that we need to be asking ourselves more along those lines rather than asking for more information, because I think, there's a lot of information, and I think that we all have various perspectives. So I just want to check ourselves, because we've been through this process before, and of course, folks, we all seek more information in an area that is uncomfortable in particular. So I just want to make sure that we at some point we close the door for information, because
My question wasn't, my information I'd be happy to get after a decision was made. It was more a matter of, if we make this decision to move this direction, we need to find out from the parents who's staying and who's not. I don't need that information to make this decision. So, but thank you.
No, again,
I know.
I'm just trying to
I
get
gotcha.
clarity in regards to what exactly, particularly given that in some ways, Director Belay and I are tasked with trying to provide you with some information in between meetings. So I just want to have some clarity in regards to what are we asking for, because we can continue to send staff to search for more staff, but I think they gave it their best shot and they put something at the table, and now we got to figure out whether we accept that or we come up with something better or different.
Well, I think fair enough, but I totally agree that we have to, at a certain point, stop asking for more information. But there's also the balance of feeling like we know enough and have enough confidence in the planning that it's going to be a solid plan that will be implemented well. So there's a balance there. And we do have a study session scheduled, so I guess that's why I was suggesting, rather than us coming to that study session each with our concerns, that we try to, yes, narrow it down, but I think the way you frame it is absolutely right. What do we need to know in order to be comfortable supporting this? So that's helpful framing, and that's where I'll take to my concerns. But
And again, I wasn't trying to get you to be comfortable to support this. I was trying to make you comfortable to make a decision. Okay, let's be clear, about that in regards to what I was saying.
right.
Okay.
Tough decisions.
Any other clarifying questions?
I was just going to say that the way I ended my comments 2 weeks ago when we were talking about this is whether we're comfortable doing nothing, and I'm not comfortable doing nothing. So, we have to figure out a path forward, and some community or communities are going to be impacted, but we don't have an option of subsidizing small schools, especially as we face another, $17 to $27 million cut next year. Our highest priority is to make sure that we have enough children in a building that we can provide a robust program. So it isn't that we want to impact one community or the other. We want to make sure that ultimately our kids, there's enough children in the building that we can provide a good education for them. So.
But I think in response to that, it's not doing nothing if we set up some long-term plans onto how we're going to get more enrollment in these schools. And if we want robust programs in every school, it's not only the Jefferson cluster that has schools that have too small of an amount of students to have these programs. So I don't know why we need to close a school in this district.
And I think from my standpoint, this probably is less about a budget based decision and more, because, frankly, I think it's probably going to be a blip in what needs to happen when we have to find $17 million. But it needs to be a decision driven by what we're actually offering within our.
What we can offer.
Right.
Great.
Right.
Okay. I think I was just going to move on if you have a.
We can continue the discussion another time.
Okay. Great. So again, a reminder that we have a listening session this Saturday from 10 to noon at the Jefferson High Auditorium. And then also on that February 11th work session, we'll have 45 minutes devoted to public testimony. So we hope to hear from our community. So moving on to our next agenda item, graduation rates. On January 31st, the state released its annual graduation rate data, and staff is here to share this information with us. And Superintendent Smith, if you could introduce the item.
And actually, I'll ask Sue Ann Higgins, our Chief Academic Officer, and Trip Goodall to come on up, our Director of High Schools to come on up. Thank you.
And just a reminder to the folks that are exiting, it gets kind of loud back in the vestibule. I know it feels like you're away from us, but you're not. So if you could quietly exit, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Sue Ann Higgins, Chief Academic Officer. It's a pleasure to give you some updates from our 2012 graduation cohort. And joining me is Trip Goodall, Director of our high schools, as well as a number of our high school administrators are present tonight. And additionally, many of our Jefferson Cluster administrators are here tonight as well. So we just want to acknowledge and thank all of them for their time and participation here this evening. I know that the board received a packet of both the data grids as they are downloaded from the state, as well as some bar graphs to help pull out some of the data. So we will go through some highlights of the data. So to begin with, the four-year cohort graduation rate in Portland Public Schools increased by 1 percentage point in 2012 over 2011. So our growth was very flat in the aggregate. This was, however, the third year in a row that the rate increased, and a total of 63% of students graduated in 4 years. And of those who started in community comprehensive or focus high schools, 78% graduated in 4 years. And it's important to note that, so as we look at our data and try to pull out learnings from it, it's important to sort of look at where do we see which kinds of behavior. And one of the things that we know from a variety of studies is that students who start high school in PPS end stronger and are much more likely to graduate on time than students who arrive later to our system. And so that's causing us to put additional resources around students who arrive late, including identifying them for academic priority status, even if they're not having other complicating factors at the time they arrive, such as low performance. So, Trip will talk us through some of our achievement data, as well as our work on our milestone to close our racial achievement gap or opportunity gap.
Thank you, Sue Ann.
Yep.
Thank you, Sue Ann. If we look at the achievement gap, there's a lot of work to still be done to accomplish our goal of every student, regardless of race or class, being successful in our schools. And so when we look at the first point there, our achievement gap grew in terms of our Native American population of students. It's at 39 points. It's up 16 percentage points from
the previous cohort. So we have to do a much better job of determining how best to serve our students who are Native American. Our Grant High School closed the achievement gap in graduation rates among both white, black, and Hispanic students. Franklin, Jefferson, Roosevelt, and Wilson high schools all posted graduation rates for black students equal to or better than those for white students. It's not on our slide here, but Lincoln also has a 96% graduation rate for the Hispanic population at Lincoln. The next slide is our bar graph, which gives you an opportunity to look at data over time. And so for the most part, you can see, again, a trend that's moving upward. As Sue Ann said earlier, it's flat at this moment in terms of overall, our graduation rate only going up by a percentage point. But you can see it's illustrative of the fact that across most of our schools right now, we're seeing a trend that's encouraging. As I pointed out in the earlier slide, our data on Native American in 1 year is something of concern, and it's unacceptable. And so we're going to have to take a good, strong look at what we're doing to serve those students better. If we look at highlights from this cohort, our Madison graduation rate increased 8 percentage points to 71%, a 15-point increase in the last 2 years. Franklin posted a 7 percentage point increase. Both Madison and Franklin's graduation rates include former Marshall campus students. Wilson saw a 7 percentage point increase, and then Jefferson and Roosevelt both posted 4 percentage point increases. For Roosevelt, that would be close to about 16 percentage points, again, over the last 2 years. And I'm going to ask both Charlene Williams and Petra Cowan, principals at Roosevelt and Madison, to come up here. I will tell a quick anecdote. When the information first went out, Petra called me, and in this work sometimes there are those moments where you hear the pride, and I heard this last year from a number of principals, but I hadn't had that opportunity with Petra. And when she saw that Madison's graduation rate had gone beyond 70%, it was really incredible to hear that voice and the pride that she has in the staff and the students at that school. And so I just wanted to again acknowledge that. It was rewarding for me to hear how committed that voice really is. So Petra Cowan and Charlene Williams.
So actually, I did ask Tripp if it was real, and if I could tell people, because I could. It took a moment for it to sink in. Madison has been through a great deal of transition in the last few years. We're in the 4th year of being a community comprehensive after transitioning from 3 small schools, which was no small transition, as well as welcoming the Marshall staff and Marshall students onto the campus. And the graduation rate was a concern for everybody at the school, and it still is. It still is not where we want it to be. But the actually almost 16% increase in 2 years has been really significant for us. We have seen some increases within some of our subgroups, such as our Latino students at 80%, English language learners, I think, at about 75%. So we've seen some really great increases, but we are also concerned about our students who are not making the increases that we're wanting yet. And so it's a focus for us. We have been working collaboratively to engage students in classes, been working really hard to design and implement effective interventions ahead of the game instead of at the later stages of a student's career when it's too late. We've been offering students multiple pathways to demonstrate their proficiency. One thing that the school improvement grant we have has allowed us to do is bring students in on Saturdays, provide them with summer opportunities, and engage them in a variety of ways so they're able to meet that mark. We have used our grant to provide students with with opportunities and support that we couldn't have. We have staff members that are catching students and supporting families. We are engaging partners. We are continuing to use extended hours for teachers to really look critically at our programming and our curriculum and instruction to ensure that we're doing best by students every single day. We are committed to increasing achievement for each and every student at Madison. And the money, I have to say, though it is not everything, it does make a difference. So I would really like to express how important it is that our schools are funded and our schools are supported, because once this grant goes away, we will still have the commitment and we will still have the fire and the drive, but we will not be able to offer as many opportunities as we can right now.
And I'd like to echo Petra's sentiments around the funding piece. As Tripp alluded to earlier, Roosevelt has experienced a 16-point increase in its graduation rate over the last 2 years. The first group with the gain last year was actually under the Gear Up grant, as well as overlapping with some support from the school improvement grant. And so we had a cohort of graduates who had had support from middle school all the way through high school, helping them think about college, think about life beyond graduation, and give them extra opportunities and skills. And then with the school improvement grant, I've been able to hire an additional counselor who is finally catching up with the enrollment, which is great, because when the enrollment increases, then you actually have the staffing to support the number of counselors you need. But we're talking about populations definitely coming with different levels of need. So having the additional resources for our school is what's helping us make the difference, along with some amazing, talented teachers who are doing all they can in order to help students meet essential skills for graduation, instructional coaches who are working with teachers to model and support and get additional resources to them, culturally specific resource specialists who are able to relate to kids and work with their families to ensure that they are engaging with the school and that their needs are being met as well. And I brought our latest newsletter for the Roosevelt Cluster because I know the work we do at the high school doesn't start at high school, but these are the principals that are in the Roosevelt Cluster who are also fighting this and definitely own a part of the increase in the graduation rate that we have on in the Roosevelt Cluster. So I just want to just continue to, number one, thank you for supporting Roosevelt and Madison with getting the grant like SIG and whatever additional resources that will continue to allow us to target interventions so that we can continue to see the rise in support for our students.
Thank you.
Before you leave in particular Madison, and it applies to Franklin too, by the way. If you couldn't believe those results, and other people are also not believing them, particularly since you had Marshall students, and so not because they were, a challenge in regards to those students, but whether we actually. I think there's always a question whether our data is actually accurate in capturing those things, and it was noted, I think, on one of those slides that it actually takes into account the Marshall students that transfer there.
Yes.
And it's based on that 4-year cohort in regards to when they started, rather than, we're not counting the students that didn't show up at that school.
I actually couldn't answer that question. So somebody, Sue-Ann or Tripp, might be able to help answer that. But from what I understand, it includes the cohort, but whether or not students who never showed up at Madison are included in that number, I couldn't answer you.
They can't be.
Great, thank you. And are you back for questions or discussion, or do you have a little bit more presentation?
Just two quick other points. I would say you should be pretty disappointed in us if we were very happy with our aggregate graduation rate. And what I would add, however, is that given the amount of changes in implementing the high school system design that included the closure of Marshall High School, that included the state increasing its requirements to include the essential skill of reading, including other transitions in the system, I'm pleased to see that we still had progress on the overall rate, and that we have in our system of high schools right now evidence of all of the practices that we need to actually have 100% graduation rate and closure of the gap in a really accelerated way. So we see closure of achievement gaps in a number of our schools. We see that while we are intentional about serving students of color better, white students are not falling behind. So we see that both are true, that we can raise achievement for all and accelerate learning for the students that we've historically underserved. So, and I would just add that the high school action team is about to be commissioned. So one of the recommendations coming out of the high school system design report is that we would launch an action team, which I will be coordinating. And so the first step for that team will be to continue the recommendation to continue implementation of the high school system design recommendations. Also to determine if all the metrics in the original report, many of which we've already met, need to be reset or reconsidered, as well as looking at improving rigor, fairness, and responsiveness around school culture and grading practices, and finally, improving the coordination across the high school system to ensure that if students are not succeeding in school, that we're having them in the best fit next step opportunity, that we're retaining a higher number of students in our gen ed schools than we have, that those kids are staying on track in terms of skills, which is the number one reason students leave or depart or need an alternative at some point in their high school career. And finally, the action team will be comprised of 20 folks that will include high school and middle school principals, teachers, higher ed partners, community employers, and others nominated by partner organizations. And there will be 20 folks sought that way, as well as 5 at-large members who will apply, and that action team charter is live right now on our website, as is the application. So we look very much forward and had a lot of really positive interest from across the community around engaging in that work over the course of the next 18 months. So, yes, questions?
Great. Do you, just to follow up to this last slide,
Yes.
do you know when the group will be meeting? I had a couple people say, hey, I might be interested, but it's hard for me to commit without knowing what the schedule is.
Right.
And it's probably a catch-22 because we probably aren't setting a time until we figure out who's on it and what their schedules are, but do we have any
Right.
sense?
What we do believe is the frequency of the larger group will be roughly once a month. We know we have not yet set a date for the first meeting or what the regular cycle of meetings will be. In the charter, it explains both that the commitment is generally a once a month meeting. I believe we'll be commissioning some subcommittees to do some other work and recommendations, and so it's likely that we will, in that work, there may be additional meetings, or we may waive some of the large group meetings, and that the committee is commissioned through June of 2014. So it would be the balance of this school year as well as all of next school year, with the possibility that the superintendent could recommend extending that beyond that as the work moves forward.
Great,
So.
thank you. Questions, comments?
Well, I could start. I was looking at the cohort graduation rate by gender.
Yes.
And it looks like in every single one of our high schools, except for Wilson, that was identical, but in every other one of the high schools, girls outperform boys. And in fact, district-wide, there's a 9-point gap in the performance of girls versus boys. And oftentimes we talk about, race and poverty, and I guess I'm curious if there's any folks who are focused on gender.
Yes. So we, as a group, both the leaders at the building level, the teachers themselves, as well as district staff, do look at gender. We know that the picture of girls outperforming boys in school is a mirror image of the fact that boys in our school system also have a disproportionate amount of exclusionary discipline. Mm-hmm. So these are two faces of the same challenge that we face around disciplining and redirecting students in ways that re-engage them and connect them with the school rather than removing them or pushing them out of the system. So this is one of the places where that is generated, and one of so the same reason that we are looking at our racial disproportionality in our discipline data is why we are also looking at determining what strategies to change in order to eliminate a gender bias in our discipline data.
Do we have any sense that Wilson is doing anything different than other schools? I mean, in some of our schools, we have a 20-point gap. I mean, has anybody tried to figure that out, whether they have programs for some reason that are more engaging to boys, or?
I don't think we have actually looked at that, but we will.
Yeah, I would
Yeah.
encourage us to, please.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I am really grateful that we have this gender now showing up. I mean, that's gender data is showing up in our reports, so thank you for that, too.
Yes. Yep. I would like to also just add one thing about the data for our Native American students, as you saw, is very, very deeply concerning. And when we, so the federal guidelines drive how the racial identification is interpreted at the state level. So we actually know that Native American students are counted in other groups as well. This is true of other racial subgroups. So if a family marks more than one racial subgroup, their data automatically falls into multiracial. And so when we actually look at the graduation data for our Native American students by their affiliation with our Title VII Indian Ed program, we see a considerably brighter picture. Over the last 3 years, at least a 15 percentage point improvement over these rates as published. So we know that data slices always tell a certain story, and so this is one that we're trying to unpack and determine why we see such a big gap between those the data that you see here, and when we look at Native American students aggregated through a different lens with affiliation in our Title VII program. So, so I would just add that we are trying to understand that differential and understand also what are the supports that students are receiving through our Title VII Indian Ed support, and is that one of the things that's closing that achievement gap for those students. So those culturally specific services, both there and in the larger community. So
given the information that you just provided, I mean that would make it flat one year to the other if that 44% of the previous year was also took into account that multiracial.
right.
And did it?
Would you repeat the question? I apologize. I couldn't hear.
You said that there will be, if we took into account, that they were counted somewhere else.
Yes.
In terms of the multiracial category, and you said a 15 point difference.
Yes.
That would bring us to 44%.
Yes.
Which is same as last year, and that would make it flat. But that was only if they were also using the same approach for last year.
They were. So, so last year, there was nearly a 15 percentage point difference over the 44%. And
Meaning last year it
so
would have been
each year
59%.
running, you see a different graduation rate when you compare those identified in our state system as Native American, Alaskan Native, and those students identified in our Title VII rosters. So,
So you're saying it's been fairly consistent?
so that has been consistent,
Been
right?
consistent, and the data that we see here, the two bars are comparing apples and apples.
Yes, they are.
And then you're saying that if we looked at the
Right.
orange you just offered, which is if you just
Yes.
look at Title VII affiliation,
It's oranges to oranges.
oranges
yes,
to oranges,
right?
right?
Yeah.
Then last
and
year
that
would have
and
been a
that
15%
gap,
increase, which would have been 59.
Right. So it's a stronger rate
Right.
every year there as well.
A stronger rate, but nonetheless, we had a drop.
Significant.
Yes, absolutely.
So this might be a nice lead into my comments.
Please.
You'll probably be hearing more of my comments later on this topic. And, one of the things that resonated with me when the Cleveland cluster came in, one of the principals talked about the students that are hidden within the data and breaking some of that down. And I think that was really appropriate. It resonated with me because I think the Native students are hidden within our data, and frankly, I think one of the unfortunate things is that our Native students are hidden within our classrooms too, which is an incredibly isolating experience for these students. And whether or not it is lack of resources or lack of interest, the fact of the matter is that from my experience, is that our Native American students are not finding themselves in what we're offering. There isn't something that resonates with them that draws them to our schools. And if I were to use some of the language coming from our state, this calls for targeted investment. It calls for an investment in a community that if we don't figure out this, we're not going to figure out the rest. And obviously I have a lot of passion about this particular community, but it's one that I see on the cusp of thriving every single day, educationally thriving every single day, and but with lack of access, lack of resources, lack of services, lack of culturally specific responses to the needs to that community. And that's what I would ask us to look at as we're unpacking some of this data. We look at what are some of the things that we can do to help invest in this community, because our destinies really are tied. And if we're not making those movements in this community, we're not going to reach our goals as a district.
Absolutely.
Sure.
First of all, I'm very pleased to see that this is the third year in a row that we have gone up, although, as we all say, we have a long way to go still. So, yeah, but it's nice to see we're in the right track, and congratulations again to Madison and Roosevelt and these other schools who went up. My question, though, has to do with our countable alternatives,
Yes.
where the graduation rate's 21%. And that's even going down for LEAP. Can you talk a little bit about those, and what are we doing to turn those around, or turn that around, or?
Yes. So I would add two things. One is, so because students in our alternative schools, such as Alliance and our other community-based schools, are necessarily to qualify to be a part of those programs, are credit deficient, have experienced other interruptions in their schooling. And so we don't believe that the four-year graduation rate is the best way to measure them. The students entering those programs are on average 17 and a half years old and have 7 credits. So the idea that those students would then graduate on time is quite optimistic. Additionally, the majority of those students started school in one of the other schools' cohorts. And so what you're seeing is the graduation rate of those students who did not start ninth grade in one of our other programs. We know that there is a protective factor for students who start high school in one of our schools within our system. They're likelier to graduate in a 4-year cohort. So the rates that you see here don't show you the number of kids, for instance, who graduated from Alliance last year but were attributed to Franklin, to Marshall, to Roosevelt, to one of the other schools. So if they began their ninth grade year there, the way the state cohort graduation rate works, those students are attributed to the high school that they started in, not the one they finished in. So we're continuing to dig down and understand more. So what does the graduation cohort for each of these schools look like as well? So that's in terms of so how do we need to complicate our thinking about what the data shows and doesn't show? So a lot of graduates have been disappeared out of their data and populated into the school where they started. So that's part of the partnership piece.
Can I just ask you so I can get it clear in my head?
Yes.
So for Alliance, it says they had 137 students in their cohort. None of those students started in any Portland Public School high school. Is that right? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying that probably most of them started in another PPS school.
Okay.
But the kids who were completing their 4th year of high school, so in other words, who were in that 4-year cohort, how many of them graduated and were not attributable to another accountable school or another comprehensive school, is the rate you see of a meager 21%.
So using the 137 again, so some of those students started in another one of our schools, many of them, you're saying?
Yes.
And are attributed to those schools. So
Yes.
the only ones we have left to make up this 21% is a smaller, that doesn't make any sense the way that's figured.
It's a smaller
to me.
group. So this is a challenge of the cohort rate,
Right.
is that,
So they're either in the cohort at the beginning and at the end, or they're not, to me. Why would you put them in the cohort? I know we don't do it, but why would we put it in the cohort at the beginning if they're going to be attributed outside the cohort in the end? Why wouldn't they just stay with those schools?
So what the state wants to do with its cohort rate, I believe, is hold our whole system accountable. So what about these kids, and are you graduating all of these kids? So it goes back to when we used to look at our graduation rate and said, how many kids who started senior year finished senior year? And so our rate was much higher. And now that we look at who are all the kids who joined us in freshman year, and then who are all of the kids who join us after, and they all become a cohort based on the year they started freshman year, and wherever they started freshman year, if they started freshman year in an accountable school, they're attributed back to that school. If they did not, then they're attributed to district programs or
Alliance
to
or
the.
LEAP or whatever.
So I think one of the
Yeah.
questions then, and maybe this gets to your point,
think
Director
it's
Knowles,
two.
is that
Yes.
if I'm looking at this grid,
Yes.
right? And I'm looking at the class of 2011 or 2011-12, and I'm looking at the cohort.
Yes.
And there are numbers for Benson, Cleveland, Franklin.
Yes.
And then there's numbers for Alliance, LEAP, and Trillium.
Yes.
Now, some of those kids in Alliance, LEAP, and Trillium may have started in one of our comprehensives, but does that mean the state's double counting them originally? Like, if I just go down this, couldn't I figure out all the number of kids that or are some of them double counted down here and up here?
So ostensibly, they are not double counted.
Okay, so 21% would be of that pure number of 110. Because any number that's
Yes.
being assigned back to a cohort is already attributed
Oh, I see what you
back
mean by
there.
double counted.
You can't say that you have a cohort of
Right.
37
Right.
and then you say they're going to be counted somewhere else. Either you have the
Right.
cohort or you don't.
Right.
it
Okay,
doesn't make
there's a
sense
missing
to me.
So
piece of
if you
this.
can
Yeah.
figure that out in regards to what's the actual number of that cohort on LEAP, and then we can say what are the actual
Yes.
numbers of it. And if
Right.
other folks graduate, I think that we also want to know that in regards to,
Right.
they contribute to graduating X number of students on this given year that were not attributed to this cohort.
Right. That said, of the students who are in their 4th year of high school, in those programs with very low performance.
Sure.
So that number is accurate. So the students who it's a both and. I'm sorry, it just is a really complex. We spend a great deal of time interpreting these data, and so.
But it shouldn't be this, we'll get the answer for you, because it shouldn't be this.
There's somebody knows about data there.
To come up and help sort this out.
Teal, thank you. Teal is our graduation rate expert.
Yeah, come on.
Do you mind? Welcome.
Thank you.
This is Teal Jackson from our Data Policy and Analysis Department, and she is our graduation rate guru.
Whiz.
Welcome. I just got dragged down the steps, so I'm not really prepared for this.
So the question is about, so when we look at Alliance and other schools with a particularly low rate, LEAP being another, can you talk about, so is that really all the kids who graduated from those schools, or all the kids that are accounted for those schools? How does that relate to the cohort that we can see?
So the rule on cohorts generally is the school that last touched the student owns the student. So for instance, a student might go to Cleveland for 3 years and then transfer to Alliance. That student's outcome will be attributed to Alliance, whether it's a graduation, a 5-year graduation, dropout, or anything in between. The exception to that is our community-based alternative programs such as PCC, Youth Progress, Open Meadow, Mount Scott. These are not considered accountable schools, and so a student that would transfer from one of our regular high schools or Alliance to Open Meadow or Mount Scott is still going to be attributed back to the original school.
But wait a minute, Betsy Hammond wrote an article saying that they were not attributed to those schools. Was that incorrect?
She didn't actually say that, but she allowed that implication to be drawn.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
And it was incorrect.
And it was incorrect.
So that sounds a little bit different.
What's that?
That sounds a little bit different.
All right.
No, this was the 3-part series that was written on alternative programs.
Right.
So in other words, the number that is
this
there
was
is
over
actually
the
the
summer.
cohort rate.
So they actually, yeah, they're not attributed back to their schools.
I'm sorry. I was going to say, for clarity, if we go back to the question about the numbers in the Alliance and the community.
So the students, the number for Alliance represents the number of students who basically were last enrolled at Alliance and whatever outcome they had. And typically, Alliance is not the first school of enrollment for most students. They are referred there from other schools, and generally, I believe they have to have they're behind on credit, or maybe they've had attendance history, or they've had discipline history. And so Alliance is almost always, I think, going to have a low 4-year graduation rate because they're starting with kids who are already behind. The same is not true for LEAP and Trillium, although I believe that LEAP's charter also specifies that they particularly want to help students who are disadvantaged or have some kind of history. So again, their graduation rate is going to reflect that. Trillium, I think, is the real kind of standout in this group because many of, as you know, they probably know they're a K-12. Many of their high school students, in fact, have been with them since elementary school, middle school. They've been in this school throughout their career, and their graduation rate is not very high.
Do we have 5-year?
Thank you.
We have 5-year rates too? Yeah. Okay. I'd love to see those.
You have 5-year rates for the cohort that was last year's graduation rate. You now have their 5-year rate right next to the 4-year rate. You see the,
It's
I don't
the
have it in front of me.
colorless
On
columns
this
here.
page, okay, hang on. That's fine.
And actually,
My
if you look
question's
at the
done.
LEAP, and I'm not looking at it now, but I was just looking at it, it was the LEAP and Alliance ones where it's a significant gain between the 4-year and the 5-year. So 5 years significantly higher.
37%
I
for
see.
LEAP.
Right, yeah. Which is consistent with Sue Ann's comments about students who end up there generally will take longer to actually complete. Yeah.
But again, those, I'm sorry that I'm still having trouble with this. So those three schools, Alliance, Leap, and Trillium, are not ones that where the numbers, where students are counted back at the comprehensive. So
Correct.
So
Those
for
they're
Alliance,
accountable schools.
okay,
Right.
so the
My mistake.
170 cohort and
Thank
the
you.
55, those are kids who, they may have been somewhere else earlier, but they ended up at Alliance, and this is what this is the total group of kids,
It is,
whether
correct.
they spent the first year somewhere else or not.
Yes.
Okay, so, but.
I should also say that their last enrollment with PPS wasn't necessarily Alliance. If they move from Alliance to one of the community alternatives, they're still accounted to Alliance because the
Okay, so
community
that's-
alternatives are not considered accountable.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Okay, but again, and then
Helpful.
the non-accountable ones, the community programs, what you were saying is that those students who graduated but who had started from that program but had started elsewhere are counted in the other schools.
That's correct.
Graduation rate. Okay.
That's
thanks.
correct. So I stand corrected. So for instance, the rate that you would see for Open Meadow or Mount Scott's graduates would include students who also graduated, who are also counted in the cohorts of other schools where they started ninth grade.
So on the far right of this slide, there's a bar that says district, and those are students who have never had an enrollment in one of our accountable schools. They've not been to one of the comprehensives, they've not been to Alliance, they've not been to Leap or Trillium. And these are students who, for instance, have been through high school at Open Meadow or Mount Scott, or who came in and went to PCC or some of our other programs of that nature. And for this year only, that also includes some students who were last seen at Marshall. And they put them in with the district group just so they wouldn't have to create a graduation rate for Marshall that wasn't meaningful.
So I'm sorry, you're saying, so that came up in the question around Madison and Franklin earlier. So you're saying that under the district category includes all former Marshalls?
No, only ones who did not re-enroll in another accountable school.
Okay,
So
so
students-
that gets to your question about, I think.
Right, I mean,
They
they were
didn't
counted
show up
in
at
Madison
the-
because they showed up at Madison, so Madison is the last school that touched them, so they're part of the
Right,
graduation.
but if they
rate.
didn't show up
Correct.
at Madison, then they're in this district.
Right.
Correct.
Okay.
And,
They're still
and
enrolled.
I think the district rate you see here is actually the aggregate district. What Teal's talking about is district-wide programs, which include students in the CBOs, in the DART schools, in Pioneer, and other programs. So, and it's a significantly lower
It's down at the bottom of your
rate.
page.
It's on your document, so.
It's like that, it says district programs, CBOs, DART, and Pioneer. It's that
Right.
bottom total. And it's only lists 500 students there.
Right.
Meaning that's not the entire total group who is in those programs. Those are the ones that didn't already touch didn't start in one of our public schools.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
I will say too, like this is part of when we do our sense making about who goes to our alternative schools, where we end up saying they both end up being a safety net of schools where as their home high school, you can identify this student needs this and refer them, and that's one group of kids, and then another group of kids are kids that are getting pulled in, who have left school and are being pulled back in, and it's a outreach and a reattachment to school, and it's two really different groups of kids. So, I mean, anyway, so just that, like, I think you really see the multiple kinds of service that our alternative programs are providing.
So Sven, I assume all these issues are going to be part of this high school task force and,
Absolutely.
yeah, okay.
Yes.
Any last questions before we move on?
Tripp, it looked like you were going to look into a question about gender. Would you also look into MLC's graduation rate for boys? Because it's like 30 points lower than girls. It's kind of shocking. So I'd be curious to understand what's happening there, too.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
So now at this time, we're going to move on to our capital bond overview. We're going to be focusing for this brief presentation for procurement. This is the second of 5 overviews that we will receive within the next few months between now and March on the capital bond. Superintendent Smith, can you please introduce this item?
So Jim Owens and Elaine Holt will provide, and I just realized Elaine got married and I just totally blanked her married name. So as Elaine Holt, who I know as Elaine Holt, we'll do the next installment on our capital bond program.
Great. Well, thank you, Superintendent Smith, and good evening. I know it's a late hour, and so we'll be quick getting through our presentation tonight. This is the second series in a presentation package that includes various components of the bond program overview. Last Monday night, we had an opportunity to present the project team framework and some of the concept of operations. Tonight, we're going to be addressing procurement, which is an extremely vital component. Very little of this bond work can be accomplished without effective and proper use of our procurement tools. And so I'm really pleased that Elaine Baker Holt, I guess we'll characterize it,
Thank you, Jim.
is here tonight with us, because I think it also highlights the close partnership that we've developed really over the last several years to put district systems in place and to be ready to execute the very ambitious program. So Elaine and I will be going through the presentation, and we'll highlight the different aspects of procurement, and we're going to try to highlight your role as a school board, as a contract review authority, because you play a very key role in terms of how we execute the contracts. So starting with our first slide, let's see what we need to get. Oh, perfect. Momentary technical difficulties.
Yeah.
Okay, it seems that we don't have the PowerPoint to be able to put up on the screen, but in your board packages you have a copy of what we're going to present, and it leads off with a memorandum that highlights this topic. So we'll try to go through this and try to articulate the main material, starting with procurement topics. So Elaine.
Thank you. So tonight we're going to provide a high overview of several topics pertaining to your role in our purchasing and contracting, as Jim mentioned. And I also want to emphasize our blended team. We've just got a fantastic team with OSM and FAM, purchasing and contracting, risk and finance. We're all working very closely together, very well together. And there's a lot of experience in the team overall. One of the overarching goals of public contracting law is to maximize full and open competition. And you've got basically 2 primary roles. One has to do with approving our contracts, and competition is a piece of that. And the other role is to approve exceptions to competition. So where we either limit competition or we choose to go directly to one vendor. So those are, in a nutshell, the 2 main pieces of your role. Tonight, we're also going to touch briefly on our equity and public purchasing and contracting policy. This you passed back in July, and we'll talk a little bit about the efforts that we're making there. So moving on to the second slide, which is Local Contract Review Board. If you've got page numbers, it's page 4. So as the governing body of Portland Public Schools, Oregon statute specifies that you are the district's local contract review board. And the Local Contract Review Board, or LCRB, has several duties. So the first one, at nearly every board meeting, you review and approve our contracts in the form of the consent agenda. And maximizing fair and open competition is at the crux of all purchasing, public purchasing in particular. The goal of our purchasing activities is to obtain the best overall value to the district, meaning not just to get the lowest price, but buying the goods and services that best meet our needs. We do this by testing the market and seeking competition, and this tool serves a dual purpose. It allows companies fair and equal access to our business opportunities, as well as getting us the best deal. Some contracting and purchasing method decisions are delegated to the superintendent, specifically contracts less than $150,000, and some of those exceptions to competition. And finally, it's important to note there's a specific audit protocol that we follow for capital bond work. Jim?
So the next slide is on PPS contracting rules. And really the principal takeaways here are that we're operating under state purchasing rules. They're specifically referred to as ORS 279, A, B, and C. And collectively, they represent all of the purchasing policy and authority that comes to us from the state level. In executing bond work, we're primarily operating in an area that we don't typically operate as a school district, that being in 279C, which is entitled Public Improvements. And public improvements are those that involve major construction, or I should say construction, reconstruction, and major alteration. And we actually have operating definitions for those terms and relative to the thresholds and the like. And in the 279C, in the public improvement category, we actually have two subcategories. One that involves selection of our architects, engineers, land surveyors, and related service providers. And then secondly, our contractors or builders that are actually involved in doing the work. So together, we go through a process to select firms and to be able to execute contracts and then manage the work. At the bottom of the slide describes what we like to think of as the three phases of a contract. We have the pre-award phase that involves developing the statement of work, the technical specifications, and then it moves into the award phase where we develop a solicitation, and then post-award, the management of the work, the enforcement of the contract provisions. And relative to the teaming that we have with district purchasing and contracting group and Office of School Modernization, we work collaboratively across all three phases as we move through the work.
Okay, so the next slide, equity in public purchasing and contracting. This refers to the policy that was passed early, or actually mid-2012. We're pleased that we're continuing to hone our internal processes, but we're planning to employ this policy as early as possible in the bond work. We already have 2 outreach events scheduled in February. The first will reach architects, and the second is directed at contractors, particularly general contractors and other construction contractors. And OSM and purchasing, along with some other departments, are working in concert on those efforts.
The next slide, that's titled Acquisition Methods, is a quick summary of the differences between how we select consultants and how we select the builders. Division 48, as it's described in our purchasing rules, involves selection of our architects, engineers, land surveyors, and related service providers. And the key takeaway here is that these are typically selected on a qualification-based selection protocol. Typically, that means price isn't included. When it is, it's not a major factor. When we recently, the state legislature changed the protocol for selection of architects and engineers when the estimated fee exceeded $100,000, where we actually couldn't invite price as a weighted factor when we were considering the selection criteria. So this is a new area for us, one that I think will actually work quite well, because architects and engineers are more of a practice that involves a creative process and flow, And so we're really looking for the firm that has the best qualifications, if you will, to do the work. District staff are trained and experienced to develop criteria that are used, and then we work collaboratively with purchasing and contracting on that. The other area is what we call Division 49, which is the public improvement construction. And here we have two primary means to execute the work. One is the traditional method, which is the tried and true design, bid, and build. And then the other is called alternative procurement. Alternative procurement involves a special approach that entails exemption that Elaine mentioned earlier. And so we have two here, one that is called the two-step process. That's where we actually can present to you as the school board a set of findings that would describe the reasons for using something other than the traditional method. The presumption under state law is that our contracts for public improvements are done using traditional. So when we use an alternative, staff prepares findings, recommendations, we'll present to you as the contract review authority, and then a short public hearing is held to validate. You recently went through this, I guess about 1.5 years ago for the boiler burner fuel conversion project, which was actually a CMGC project. CMGC is the other one that most people think of for alternative procurement, which is short for construction manager, general contractor. And CMGC is particularly suitable on large, complex tight schedule type work. And currently we're contemplating use of both of these alternative tools on some of the bond projects. And so as we continue to work and develop plans, we'll be presenting that information to you.
Okay, so our final slide. As we move forward with the bond work, it's likely that businesses may contact you at some point. We recommend you refer these bidders, contractors, and consultants to staff, and I'm your best contact for that. And just once again, to summarize, Jim and myself and the staff are working daily to maintain positive and fruitful relationships with the businesses that are interested in working with the district. We hold meetings, we hold one-on-one meetings with contractors, we hold group meetings. As I mentioned, we're coming out with a couple of outreach events, large outreach events, and we also attend all sorts of meetings weekly practically with contractors all around town. So we're working really hard to maintain, strengthen, engage those businesses.
At this time, I'd like to invite any questions that you may have.
Thank you.
So I have two questions. One is under equity in public purchasing and contracting. There's a bullet that talks about student career learning. Promote student engagement in bond work, learn career paths in design and construction industries. So my first questions are around that and what we're doing in terms of our current processes. And in particular, as we're looking to do initial work this summer, and then whatever the work is that we're going to be doing next year. Do you have a sense yet of how we're going to be engaging students?
Well, this is timely. We had a meeting at 4 o'clock this afternoon on this topic. The first thing that we're doing is working closely with the Pathways program. So Tripp Goodall and Jeannie Yurkovich's lead that up. And of course, the career coordinators are intrinsic to that. So we're focusing on programs that we already have in place first. We are looking at the resources that we have, the bond resources and the other resources, to see if there's anything that we can do to expand that. So that was what we were discussing this afternoon. But we're really building on what's already out there. That includes things like internships, job shadowing, site visits, speaking engagements, specialized projects that a school and a business might work in coordination to develop. Jim?
I also heard Director Reagan, you asked about the work for this summer. As we approach the bid phase of the summer 2013 improvements, we have for traditional, what we call ITBs, invitation to bid, construction packages that we plan to incorporate language that will engage them with our students. So as Elaine mentioned, we'll be providing an opportunity to speak to students, to provide tours of the construction job site, to get into the contractor offices, to provide students with some perspective on the construction industry. Similarly, our architect engineer firm, BBL Architects, provides a similar opportunity on the consulting side. And then lastly, our PMCM, our program manager / construction manager, Erie International, that's supporting the district, is also going to be providing robust opportunities for students to participate in the work that they're doing.
Starting as early as the summer.
Mm-hmm.
That's good. I'd love to hear more about that as we go and get more information. That's really exciting. So the other thing I wanted to ask, which isn't necessarily specific to contracting, some of it could be, is as we look at our rebuilds in particular, we know with the Fabian rebuild that we're going to be bringing in a partner, Fabian. And I'm assuming as we're looking at our 3 high school projects, we would be doing some sort of outreach to partners as well. I know, for example, when we talked about Lincoln once upon a time, there was a zillion folks in the community thinking about what are the partnerships and what makes sense. So I'm curious to know who would be doing kind of partnership outreach as we go, to kind of figure out who we can pull in to maybe make our dollars go farther or provide newer, unique, different kind of opportunities for students. And likewise, I'm curious in terms of any partnership opportunities for the work that we're doing this summer. And Jim, I had mentioned to you specifically, do we have any opportunity to potentially bring some partners in to do solar panels on our roofs, something like that. So I'm not sure if it's you all or if there's another group that would be looking at partnership opportunities, but I just want to make sure it's kind of front and center all the time, because I think we have an opportunity to really show our community that Portland Public Schools is a good partner and looking for opportunities.
That's a great comment. Relative to the partnership development, included in our blended team is work that Bob Alexander is doing with facilities and asset management. Mm-hmm. And so we are working collaboratively together, in the case you mentioned, Fabian, with Concordia University. Mm-hmm. Not only relative to the explicit MOU that we have in place, but also in terms of greater collaboration with them as we move further into the master planning phase, into design and then into construction. So I think that's probably the best example relative to how we're really going to capitalize, notwithstanding that there is a range of capital funding investment contributions that Concordia would be making, which of course will influence the program of the Fabian replacement project itself. There are a number of other opportunities, certainly with the state. I think Alameda Elementary is a good example of a partnership with the state's Office of Emergency Management and the State Rehabilitation Grant Program, which was a significant contribution to the $1.5 million to support the seismic strengthening of the school. There are other examples of other groups that are out there, and so we're going to continue to look for opportunities and to see how we can leverage Energy Trust, another one that we've talked about. You mentioned the solar, the state Department of Energy, ODO, for the SB 1149 work is another place that we can leverage this to really maximize the bond funds.
So can I just piggy on that, Jeff? I appreciate you bringing it up, because I also think that there might be non-traditional partners, not a funding source or something like that. And I think there's such momentum about being excited about this bond and about our people kind of rebuilding our schools as an infrastructure, as kind of setting another state that we do believe in public education. I just hope that we can find ways to engage a wide swath of partners outside of even contracting or funding sources. And I guess I would call on us as board members to try to find ways to open up and engage those partners as well, not to run sideways or get ahead or behind staff. but to open up those opportunities, because I think there are people that could contribute, but they don't even know the opportunity exists. Or, you know, if it's somehow not $1.5 million or $15 million like Concordia, somehow they deselect. They're like, oh, I can't contribute. But this community does such a great job of investing and recycling and reusing and finding creative, innovative ways to build on our assets, and we are a lucky community. I would love to find us a way to incorporate that.
Great comment. That's very timely as well. Our next presentation to you on the program is engagement. And so we'll highlight that. I think it's also important to connect the community and how they'll be engaged in our ed visioning and ed spec process, because community input is a partnership of sorts as well, and particularly regarding the wraparound services. I think there's going to be a lot of very dynamic input from the community on that.
Good. Other questions, comments? Dr. Morton? No. Great.
Good, thank
Thank
you.
you both,
Thank
and
you.
congratulations, Elaine. So we are moving on to Common Core state standards. So as we've moved through milestones and state achievement complex, one question that's come up is Common Core state standards, and a desire on our part to understand a little bit more about what are Common Core state standards, what are we doing to meet those, how does it affect our students. We hear various things in the community. Sometimes we hear that this is a dumbing down of standards and it's awful and it's the end of public education. And other people think it's the greatest thing in the entire world because it finally lets us level a playing field and brings us up to a standard of what to expect from public education. So tonight we have staff with us, and Superintendent, if you could introduce this item.
And this was by board request to get more background and deeper information on Common Core. So Sue Ann Higgins, our Chief Academic Officer, and Kimberly Mateer, who is the Director of Instruction, Curriculum, and Assessment, will give us actually what I think is going to be a really informative session on Common Core.
Hello, and I would just say that that our Executive Director of Teaching and Learning, Melissa Goff, was planning to do the presentation, was unable to be here due to illness tonight. So to begin with, the Common Core standards, we believe, is another strategy to move us towards our equity goals. And so we want to work through that with you this evening. Each of the leaders in our central office team this year was asked in the fall by Carol to come up with what makes you optimistic about PPS and what frames your work. And so Melissa framed hers around the leaders in her department and their shared urgency around our racial educational equity work as they lead our departments. And Dr. Mateer is one of those leaders. So right now we know that our results are inequitable insofar as some students clearly have access to and advantage from the way our instruction happens, the way our assessment happens. And so in reckoning with that, we believe that the Common Core standards work helps move us to shifts that will alter those results for us long term. So Dr. Mateer?
So Oregon has adopted the Common Core state standards, and we are one of 47 states that have adopted the standards in both English language arts and mathematics. It is a state-led effort. It's not a federal mandate, and so one of the things that that we are working on is really focusing on effective implementation and making sure that all of our students are going to be college and career ready. And so we're really excited about this adoption and glad that Oregon is taking part. So what I'm going to kind of just walk you through for this next part is the work that we're doing around introducing the standards in mathematics to our teachers and staff across the system. We started with this work last year in 2011-12 with kindergarten through second grade, and this year we are working with our fourth and fifth grade, and then in parts of our fourth grade we're focusing on the fractions domain, and we'll continue with that work next year for the rest of the areas that we'll be implementing. So if you look at the timeline, also, we started our 8th grade cohort last year, even though it's not kind of in that regular progression with the green there in that first column, because we know that our 8th graders are going to be the first cohort of students to take the Common Core State Assessment. So that's why we started them a year early. And then the rest of our grades will be introduced to the Common Core State Standards in 2013-14 with full implementation by 2014-15. There are 6 instructional shifts that we're really focusing on with our teachers and introducing those to our staff. Once a month we have job alikes where they get to learn about these shifts. We're particularly interested in highlighting the application shift in that providing increased opportunity for students to engage in application of skill and concepts of what they're being able to do and what they are learning, so that they can apply those skills in a real world kind of relevant situation through different tasks that teachers introduce to them, and showing teachers where they show up in the curriculum.
So with regard to budget implications, one of the things that we want to bring forward to you is how we are looking at what does it mean for us to make the shift to Common Core standards as well as the Smarter Balanced assessment. And so we know that because of the dramatic shift to habits of mind work that our Common Core work will require of us in order to really accelerate all students towards being college and future ready. We know that it will require extensive professional development, so we anticipate general fund costs to support this, and we're working on this in our budget proposal process right now around the professional development facilitation and production of support materials for our staff to connect the Common Core standards work with our current curricula to be roughly $500,000.
And the second area that we're adopting in terms of the Common Core State Standards is in the English language arts, and then also in literacy across content areas, so our social studies and science and other subjects, which would be focusing on reading, writing, listening, and speaking skills across content areas. So with the introduction of the Common Core State Standards in this area, we just started that work this year, so we're a year behind our math introduction, and then we'll continue to roll out, as you can see in the chart, with full implementation again by 2014-15. We did, this right here is reflecting our K-5 implementation, but our 6-8 followed that same implementation as K-2. And then we have invited our high schools to participate in the workshops that we've created for our 6-8 teachers so that they can have that information as well. Again, we have 6 instructional shifts that we're focusing on in this area, and I will just highlight a couple of them for you. For example, in number 4, we're really focusing on getting students to have increased opportunities for responding to text and having text-based answers, so really looking for evidence in the text and citing that. Whereas before we talked a lot about self-to-text, where we were getting students to kind of tap into their personal experiences and relating to characters in the text, but we want to increase the level of complexity and rigor by having them really have increased opportunities around citing evidence in response to what they're reading. The other piece is, again, around number 6, where we're really focusing on building the literacy skills across the content areas, increasing the opportunities for students to engage in those reading behaviors with increasingly complex text, so that we're actually teaching those skills beyond 3rd grade, because we know the text is getting more complex, and so we still want to provide that guided support for students.
So in terms of English language arts as well as English language development, next year is the statewide adoption year. So as you know, we go through a cycle every 7 years of adoption for curriculum materials. And so for next year, we will be connecting that adoption to the work we're doing with the Common Core standards. So one of the implications for Common Core standards is that at the high school level focuses considerably more on nonfiction reading and writing than you would typically find right now in the book rooms in our high schools. So that's one of the kinds of shifts that will then show up as we analyze what materials we want to adopt. So as always, the English language arts adoption is a really significant investment on the part of the district. Additionally, now we know that we've got to also have digitally adapted resources as well, because the work that we are doing now and resources that need to last at least 7 years and maybe longer will need to be available in a variety of formats. So all of that will be part of how we anticipate what could be as much as a $5 million investment in this adoption. So it's a really big impact. And statewide, of course, districts are reckoning with how to accomplish that simultaneous with the reduction in education funds from the state. So this will be a complex one and will be part of what you'll be seeing from us in the budget proposal process. Also, though, we are looking at how to leverage this investment. So we know that some of what we need to do for our Common Core work is to connect it to work that we're doing with in other technology-assisted areas. We're also working with the Council of Great City Schools with other districts to see how they're doing it and implementing this in a more sustainable, cost-effective way, as well as working with ODE. So there's a lot of work ahead of us on this one, and but we wanted to try to demonstrate to you sort of what does it mean to do this. So they're disconnected insofar as this just happens to be the year of the English language arts and English language development adoption year, and it's the time in which we are moving towards our Common Core state standards implementation. So that's where you see us sort of talking about them at the same time. Additionally, the kind of technical supports that we need now and going into the future continue to change and be complex. We're working closely with our IT department and looking at what kinds of technical supports will teachers need to do and use these tools, as well as the assessment tools that we're about to share with you. So the technical maintenance pieces, we believe will require budgeting around $400,000 for next year.
So, Sue Ann, I don't mean
Yes.
to interrupt, but some of the numbers that are up on these slides are slightly different than the information we got in our presentation. So I'm I'm curious I'm assuming this was created after this, and so these are maybe more
Yes.
accurate numbers? Okay.
Yes, they are.
So the ones you're presenting here are more accurate.
They are. So I apologize for the
okay.
the
Thank
difference in versions.
So can you also talk to us about, you just mentioned a $5 million investment, especially in nonfiction, and given that we're looking at a $17 million cut in our
Right.
budget next year, if we don't have the capacity to do this amount of investment, or any investment at all, what does that do in terms of introducing Common Core?
It's a really great question. And for clarification, I'm not suggesting that we would spend $5 million on nonfiction texts. What I mean is that we would be, so in this adoption, we would be looking at all of our language arts and English language development materials and doing an adoption on the state's schedule then. So what does it mean for us to not invest this much? It's complex. What we often find, and certainly this isn't the first time tough times have come around for school districts, when when adoptions get rolled forward or only partially implemented, it tends to compromise school districts long-term in terms of their ability to have the right resources available. And so so this is a really tough time to do this, and also a really, really tough and bad time not to make this investment, because we want to be aligned for the Common Core standards. Kimberly, do you want to address this further?
Yes, the Common Core state standards are only measuring the knowledge and skills that we want students to have, and it doesn't take into account how to deliver the standards instructionally. And so the piece that, especially with our equity work, is to be really thinking about how can we be responsive to students who are vulnerable to not meeting the standards, or to grow in the way that we need them to grow on time. And, so we have to accelerate our learning, because we know our students of color in particular are underperforming at this time. So the English language development and the strategies and the resources would only help to support, accelerate the learning and growth of our students of color. So that would be a way that it could hurt the Common Core implementation in terms of being more effective, having the right resources and materials to help teachers be more responsive to their students of color.
So how much money are we looking at?
$5 million.
Depends which part, yeah.
Yeah, on this one, and then this one piece, what we're talking about is $5 million. I'm just reminded, the last time that we were able to finally do a catch-up on curriculum is because 2 local levies ago, we included that in it, and that's what finally allowed us to replace 30-year-old texts. But we don't have that in our current local levy. The priority was teaching positions. So I just want us to be realistic about what we can and can't do. And I assume that every other district that's attempting to accomplish this is looking at the same challenge. So,
yes,
another thing for us to talk to our state legislators about.
Just yet another disconnect between higher and higher accountability and more mandates without being willing to invest. We just heard from high schools principals the direct impact, positive impact on having this additional resources, and this would be a similar thing. Anyway.
Absolutely huge.
Absolutely.
So just a little bit about the assessment side of this work, because we are, or we have adopted a new set of standards, and there is increased rigor or cognitive rigor around that, so that we can make sure that students are college and career ready. We've had to also design a new assessment system so that we are accurately measuring how students are responding to instruction. So the Smarter Balanced Assessment has been designed by this consortium of states in the Western region, and it is a summative assessment, which means that it's an assessment that happens after the learning has occurred. And what it's really measuring is the effectiveness of instruction and how students are responding to the activities that the teachers have designed for them to engage in. The part that is a little different than from our current OAKS assessment or state assessment is that, first I'll talk about what's similar, and that is that it is a computer adaptive test. It is measuring still the knowledge and skills that students have, but because everything can't be measured on a computer, they have added a component that comprises of performance tasks. And a performance task is really more of a real world kind of relevant situation that they ask students to think about, and the students will then use a variety of what they've learned over the course of years, so not just 1 year of time, but they could apply what they learned even in 2nd grade or 3rd grade, and then apply all of the different concepts that they learned about to this one task. So it's really getting at the thinking and how they're approaching a situation or a problem so that they can have more of a real world kind of relevant experience. So I didn't know if you.
Do you want to address these?
So in terms of the technology implications, there are technology standards that have also been adopted. We do want our students to be ready for 21st century, and we know that we live in a very technology-driven society, and so it is important for us to make sure that we're building those skills in for students and having that experience. With a smarter balance, there's also a technology piece in there, in that the students will have to create visual models and things like that. So it's a little bit more sophisticated than what we're seeing on the Oaks, on the technology side of things. So it's really, we just want to ensure that our students are getting a well-rounded, comprehensive educational experience, and technology is an integral part of that work.
One of the other pieces of the Smarter Balance that is also a challenge is that it's the cost to us from the state is about double per student what the Oaks assessment is. So it's more complex to administer because it has students doing some independent tasks, and so that will also have budgetary implications for us over time. At this time, we have, I believe, only 2 schools piloting it. So we're at a stage where we're, given that we're 2 years out from full implementation, where we are learning to use the tools and adapt them, make certain that we have the technological upgrades in our planning and budgeting processes so that we are ready to start when this takes hold.
And in PPS, we have 2 schools piloting it?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Has anyone else piloted it before we've piloted it?
So the pilot is happening at the same time across multiple districts and states. So we've had opportunities to sample some of the items and take a look at individual items, but not in a more comprehensive way, such as some of the pilot schools are doing at this time. And they were pre-selected, so it's not, we didn't have any involvement in that piece.
Have they gotten any feedback at this point?
Not yet.
So, and again, one difference that Kimberly described is that the Smarter Balance is administered at the end of the school year. So one of the kind of unusual things about the Oaks test is that you start testing mid-year, and then if kids don't make you test them again, and rather than actually assessing, so what happened over the course of this school year, from the end of last year to the end of this year. So it intentionally targets the last 12 weeks of school for all students to really capture, so what have the gains over this year been. So we hope that it should give us a better portrait of what the year's instruction shows in terms of additional skills students have.
So if students don't pass those tests, is it tied to graduation?
So the Smarter Balance will replace the Oaks test. So yes, it will replace.
So if they
as
take
the
it in the
House
last 12 weeks of school, will they have time to retake it if they've failed?
So it's not given annually. It's given on the same to the same grade bands that the Oaks test currently is. So for high schoolers, that's the junior year. Yes.
So, do you have any more with your presentation, or is
That's it.
okay?
Yes.
So I just want to open it up to colleagues for any additional questions.
When you said Smarter Balanced assessment costs 2 times more than Oaks.
Oh, you got that.
Yes. So first of all, this is what the whole state's moving toward?
Yes, what all of 47 states are moving towards.
And
yes.
do we know what that means for our district in terms of the cost?
I don't have the dollar figure.
We don't have it at this time.
Are we talking hundreds of thousands? Are we talking millions? Are we talking about?
Not millions.
Okay, that's good.
But if we know what Oaks costs us,
Right.
right?
Do we know what Oaks
times
Right,
costs
two.
so the variables I don't know, so we know that Oaks costs around $13.50 per student. We believe Smarter Balance will be in the range of $26 per student is the most recent figure I heard. And I don't know the N of how many students we test in 3rd, 5th, 8th, and 11th grades right now, so, but it's several thousand students.
So it's $13.50 for each time during the year, or total for the whole year's worth of maybe multiple times taking the Oaks test?
That's a good question. I think it is just the one time. I don't think it's the multiple times, so.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that sort of appeals to me about what sounds like improvement with the smarter balance one is that we aren't doing this constant throughout the year pressure on teachers to be spending so much time doing that, potentially. Although the other question I had was just around, do you know, I mean, this isn't maybe a federal mandate, but it's a state mandate. And do you have, so you're complying with it and doing your best to comply with it, which I appreciate. But so this is a question not really at you, but at, you know, the powers that be that are bringing this to us. I mean, do you have a sense of how much teacher involvement there was in developing either the standards or the Smarter Balanced Assessment?
Yes, there was quite a bit of involvement. So with the consortium, it included stakeholders from all levels, really, even policymakers, teachers were definitely involved from the very beginning all the way through the process. And then the Governors Association. There was also a national council of chief state officers. So really, at every single level, all of the stakeholders have been represented throughout the entire process.
For the standards as well as for the assessment?
Yes, the standards actually have been developed by educators, leading educators across the country.
Well, that's
Have students been represented?
I don't know how much student involvement there was in designing and developing the standards. However, during the revision, getting feedback, there were multiple or involvement from community. So just as you see, PPS goes through a particular process and getting stakeholder feedback and that kind of thing, there's been feedback from a variety of different community groups. I believe parents have had some feedback and that kind of thing. So this is based on a set of international standards. It's very research-based. It's not that it just came out of nowhere. This has been going on for a couple of decades in terms of really thinking about how we can increase the level of rigor for students so that they can be successful once they exit the school system and have a viable way to you know, to live and to work. So,
how's this gonna? Yeah, how's this going to affect our ESL students and our language immersion students?
Actually, I think this is a prime opportunity to accelerate the growth of our students who have been underperforming traditionally, and that they will actually have increased opportunities to meet the cognitive rigor demands that are being asked for by our workforce and for our colleges.
How so?
Because these standards are directly aligned to help students meet those entry-level skills that are needed, and it's also gives a more of a guidance. It has focused the work of teachers so that it's not so broad. So we often have teachers are trying to cover a lot of topics, and so the amount of topics that are being covered has been reduced because there's a more focused and coherent way that the standards have been developed so that it can really allow the teachers to go at a deeper level with students, and they have deeper learning.
Am I correct in that they looked at the skills necessary for college and career readiness, and then they basically back mapped what would be an age-appropriate skill?
Yes.
Not necessarily even content, but what skills are needed to access whatever content students come across. Is that correct?
Absolutely, but with the content, then they focused it and reduced the number of topics that students needed to know.
Colin, any other questions?
Just a comment. I mean, based on the presentation, one of the things that I think you highlighted was the whole emphasis on literacy instruction in all content area. For a number of years, at least this district and surveys they've been put forth. I mean, there were a number of challenges for teachers. One of them was, of course, classroom management. The other one was literacy instruction in the content area,
right,
and their lack of preparation in that area, or at least some gaps that they identify themselves.
Right.
It seems to me that there is potential to address that, I guess, ongoing challenge, in the district, and to then impact the overall achievement of students if we actually do that investment in this way.
Absolutely, you're right on target.
Can I ask another question? I think in your in the longer materials that we had, you had a slide around the limitations of the Common Core in terms of equity. So could you talk about that a little bit? And I mean, my note on the side was, I mean, so what you state is that, and I think it's about, in the longer packet, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7th slide in, that the Common Core state standards do not explicitly foster development of students with cultural and linguistic backgrounds, deep exposure and understanding multicultural perspectives, articulate culturally responsive strategies. So my question was, so therefore PPS will what?
So actually, it really aligns itself well with the work that we're doing with our equity work across the district. And so it's just integrating those two pieces together. And so we talk about our instructional strategies with our teachers, and really it's about what do you know about your students? What are the assets that they're bringing to the classroom? So taking what you know in terms of their strengths and the areas that you want to grow them, so their strengths culturally, academically, socially, so looking at the whole child, and then taking that and infusing that into how are you going to design a lesson that the students can be highly engaged and motivated by. And I think with this focus on being, real world and relevant, looking at multiple perspectives, is a way to kind of get at that. So it's marrying the two pieces.
And I think it also bears saying it's not a curriculum. So it's a framework. It's not standardization. It's a set of standards. And so it remains incumbent upon us and our instructors throughout the district to make certain that really mining the rich cultural heritage of all our students is a connection in the curriculum in every class and every content area. So we call that out, and then we felt like we needed to shorten the presentation.
Yeah.
So sorry that you have two
No.
different versions, but
I know you're always being pressured in that direction.
so we call it out though to say that so this is not magic either. What it does is allow us to, I believe, have a more adaptive or focused for large-scale change characteristic, as opposed to another set of standardization from the state that says, read this, do this, jump this way, et cetera. So this is asks for more complex tasks to be accomplished by teachers and by their students, and for us to really be preparing kids for the 21st century in a way that standards have not really gotten us to yet. So
the Common Core themselves are not inherently designed or talking around the same equity goals. So what you're saying is that it can help foster that, but it's going to be incumbent on us to make sure that we keep that we add to that and make sure that it's integrated with it. So that part isn't being mandated or standardized or supported in any way by the state. So I'm just calling that, and I appreciate you guys calling that out, because we have to make sure that we're doing both of those. So
I do also just want to point out, though, that even though it's not called out specifically in the standards, in the documents in which the Common Core is introduced, it talks about rigor, relevance, and relationships, and really promotes the idea of districts infusing what they know about their kids in terms of their assets, and being really responsive culturally as you're thinking about lesson design and instructional delivery. So.
And linguistically, I saw that.
Yes, and linguistically,
great,
yes.
Thanks.
You have another question, though?
Yeah. So I feel like if you're going to have this common curriculum, and even if teachers can kind of switch it up a little bit, you still end it all on a standardized test, which still kind of implies that there is a specific sort of information that you're supposed to obtain from taking that course. And as we all know, those highly correlate to income and are racially biased, and I feel like as a whole this is a pretty inequitable solution, and it's still a standardized system, and I don't know why we're not working on just community control of our schools.
So I just want to respond by saying the test, the summative test, and any kind of test or assessment is really just to for us to have, it's a check and balance. What is it that our students need? And helping us to identify that so we can meet their needs. It's not meant for any other reason than to make sure we are tasked to make sure that our kids receive what they need so that they can be college and career ready. If they're not college and career ready, then they won't be able to have gainful employment and to be able to live, an independent and, to be able to participate and be fully able to take care of themselves. We know that the unemployment rate is extremely high. We have a shortage on jobs, and we are now in a globally competitive environment. And so we need to make sure that our students have the skills and the knowledge to be able to get a job, to be able to take care of themselves. So it's our responsibility. That's what we're tasked with.
Well,
just like a doctor is required to check and see what are the symptoms, what are the needs of their patient, and then how can they help their patient get better.
So I'm going to ask to my right if there are any other questions, but as a quick response, I heard it's not a curriculum, it's a set of tasks and skills that people should have. How a teacher in a classroom access that is totally within their right and their freedom to figure out how to do that.
Absolutely.
But I don't think, I would be surprised if generally in public our community would think that by the time you get to the end of high school you shouldn't be able to do certain tasks or have certain skills. So I guess I don't view this as removing local control. In fact, what I heard you say is that there's still a lot of control. In fact, there's a focusing. We're not expecting you to do a wide array, but there are some core skills that you need to have by the time you leave our system to be college and career ready. And how a teacher gets to that, we're going to make sure that the skills are there, but the content,
right,
whether it's you memorize the Pledge of Allegiance or whatever, that's going, I feel like, going away. And it's saying now, how do you make sense of the Pledge of Allegiance as a document, and how do you put it in context, and how do you, as an 8th grader or a 10th grader, even access the language in it? So I guess I'd caution us again to use what I would say kind of sound bites out there in the community. And that's what I think the value is in learning a little bit more. And it's not that this is be all end all, like this is the right way to assess every student. But I think it's just an understanding of what it is.
So I would also say that I think what you were trying to point out is it's our test of ourselves. Are we meeting the needs of our students?
Absolutely.
And that's just as important as are our students passing the test.
Mm-hmm.
It's are we, if they're not, why aren't they, and what do we need to do differently?
Exactly.
And that's where I see the important piece of this.
Yes.
So I believe that these assessments do what our best teachers do, which is really look at how are kids progressing through a set of skills that really make them able to have habits of mind that allow them to navigate in a complex society. So I think that there's opportunity here, and we are engaging our teachers in developing sort of how do we align with these standards then on what we believe in about what we've done and what we believe we've not done well. How do we realign that so that these standards pull us forward? So
Director
look forward
Morton.
to it.
So thank you very much for the presentation on it. It's interesting to look at this and get our heads around it a little bit. I think I work at an organization that serves one of our most underserved populations, and in fact, we're pretty assessment heavy. Many of the students that we work with are case managed with youth advocates, folks that work with them all along sort of the academic curriculum and spectrum. But what the key to it is how you use that information. And I remember when Ben Cannon and Whitney Grubbs came to maybe a year ago or 2 years ago and talked to us about much of this, I had similar comments. The key really is how do you do it? And I'll say that the assessment that my organization uses is actually the MAP assessment, which is being boycotted at Garfield High School right now. But it's used in Seattle, but it's used really as a per student map, literally, that designs what the interventions need to be, how you address those specific things with that student. It's very student-centric, very student-specific. I think the challenge is that that's the best use for it. Whether or not, another evaluation process is best for other uses, I don't know. But I found when used in that manner, it actually gives you a lot of really concrete information about that particular student and actually a path to bring that student up to benchmark and beyond benchmark. So my experience with one of our most underserved populations is that, in fact, these can be really helpful tools, but we use it in the way in which it was intended.
You're absolutely right, and I'm sorry, just want to make this last comment because I think it's really important that assessments are just to give us feedback on how we can better meet the needs of our student. And it's also, the more that you can work in partnership with students and families so that you're looking at the information together, it is a very powerful thing, a way to really, to be transformative for students. Unlike when coaches are working with their basketball team or soccer team, they're constantly giving feedback. When they have a scrimmage and they give they're looking, and that's kind of an assessment. They're looking to see how are the students or the folks on the team, how are they playing, how are they using their skills in a setting where the variables are changing, and how are they learning about their teammates in terms of their strengths and weaknesses? How are they evaluating and analyzing the situation? And so the coach then, after observing, gives their students or teammates feedback, and then they go and practice those skills. So the intervention is then the coach would then work on some discrete skills, maybe like dribbling or passing the ball or something like that. So assessment and feedback is a part of our everyday life. It doesn't just happen in the school, it happens in the real world all the time in work settings. And so it's just something that we want students to feel empowered by, and it's not something that they should feel is something bad or negative.
And by the way, those students that are going through that assessment are graduating at about 20 points higher than our district average. So.
Great. We have about 5 more minutes. Director Regan, I think you had a question or
Well, I had
comment.
2 things. One is we got this one sheet that talked about the summary of core components of the Smarter Balanced program, and I guess what I appreciated is that it talked about the summative assessment at the end of the year, but it also had a whole section on interim assessments along the way, which I think gets to what you were talking about.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
That's good. I guess one of the things I wanted to follow up on, I think it was Director Atkins who asked about whether we had much teacher input. I forget, or was it you? Had much teacher input, and I think the response we got was more about teacher input on the national level and the rest. And I guess as we're looking at rolling this out, I guess I was looking for what the engagement's been at the district level.
Oh, I see.
In
Yes.
particular, and with PAT and.
Yes, and we have representation again. We have a CCSS advisory council or
Okay.
committee, and that has principal stakeholders, teacher stakeholders, and then I've also been working with parents since I've been involved, and so there's a parent component as well. We're going to be also establishing parent academies so that parents are actively engaged in this conversation as we continue to move forward with our implementation. We've had a lot of good feedback. Anytime you're rolling out something new, you've always got to tweak and refine, and so we've had a lot of good feedback in terms of the implementation and things that we can do to better support at every level of the
And
system.
what are the 2 schools that you're following this project?
Oh, Roosevelt's one of them, because he talked about it last week.
I am so sorry.
Yeah.
I don't. I had it.
I can't recall what the second one is either. I apologize.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Now the board will consider our business agenda. Ms. Houston, are there any changes to our business agenda? No, thank you. Do I have a motion to adopt? Thank you. Director Gonzalez moves to adopt the business agenda. Do I have a second?
Second.
Director Adkins seconds the business agenda. Director Gonzalez moves and Director Adkins seconds the adoption. Ms. Houston, is there any citizen comment? No citizen comment. Is there any board discussion about the business agenda? Not today, all right. The board will now vote on the business agenda. All in favor, please indicate by saying yes.
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 All opposed, please indicate by saying no. The business agenda is approved by a vote of 6-0 with Student Representative Garcia voting
Yes.
yes. Just a reminder that the board will hold a public hearing on Superintendent's Jefferson Enrollment Balancing Recommendation on Saturday, February 9th from 10 a.m. to noon in the Jefferson High School auditorium. We will also be devoting the first 45 minutes of our February 11th work session to public comment on the recommendation. The next study session of our board will be held on February 11th at 2013 at 6 p.m. This meeting is adjourned.